The boy had been dead for 3 hours before anybody in town noticed he was gone. That was the kind of town Redstone Creek had become. Jesse Calhoun found the body face down in the shallow part of the river, just below the mill wheel, where the water runs slow and cold even in August. Jesse was 12 years old, and he had gone down to the river to catch crawdads before his mother called him in for supper. He did not scream when he saw the man lying there. He had seen things in his young life that had already taken the scream out of him. He just turned around and walked up the hill to the sheriff's office and stood in the doorway until the man behind the desk looked up. "Sheriff." "Yeah, boy. There's a dead man in the river." The man behind the desk, whose name was Cord Pickett and who had been the law in Redstone Creek for 11 years, set down his coffee cup very carefully. He looked at the boy. "Where at?" "Below the mill." Cord Pickett put on his hat. He did not reach for his gun. He had not reached for his gun in a long time. "Come show me." The dead man's name was Thomas Eddy. He was 26 years old. He had come to Redstone Creek 4 months ago to work the Silver Assay office, a quiet young man who wore clean shirts and kept his hair parted on the left, and always tipped his hat to women on the street. Cord knew him by face. He had bought coffee at Ruby Bell's counter a dozen times, sitting 2 stools down from Thomas Eddy, and the man had never done anything to anybody as far as Cord had ever seen. He had a mother in Houston who wrote to him every Sunday. Later, when Cord found out about the mother, it sat in his chest for a long time and would not move. There was a bruise on the back of Thomas Eddy's head the size of a man's fist. Cord stood over him in the shallows with his boots getting wet, and he felt something move in his chest. Not grief exactly. Something older and heavier than grief. The feeling a man gets when he already knows the answer to a question before he asks it, and he has been not asking it for a while, and the not asking has become a habit, and the habit has become a way of living, and he knows it, but he has told himself enough reasonable things that he has almost stopped knowing it. "Who did this, Jesse?" Jesse stared at the water. "The mill owner's son." Cord looked at the boy. The boy did not look back. He kept his eyes on the dead man in the river. "I saw them." "When?" "Before supper. Young Mr. Harwick and 2 of his men. They took Mr. Eddy out back of the assay office and they hit him with something, and then they carried him down to the river." Jesse swallowed. "I thought they was just roughing him up. I didn't know they was going to." He stopped. "I didn't know." Cord put his hand on the boy's shoulder. "You couldn't have known, son. Go home to your mother. Tell her what you saw. All of it." "Yes, sir." The boy left. Cord stood there in the water a long time. Harwick. The name sat in his mouth like a bad tooth. Clayton Harwick owned the mill. His father had owned it before him, and his grandfather before that. The Harwick family had been in Redstone Creek since before there was a Redstone Creek, back when it was just a bend in a river with no name and a stand of cottonwood trees nobody had claimed yet. Clayton Harwick was 38 years old, and he had the wide face and small eyes of a man who had never once in his life been told no and believed it. He ran the mill. He ran half the businesses on the main street. He ran the town council, and the council ran everything else. And for the past 2 years, he had been running something else besides all of that. Something quieter. Something that happened in the back rooms of buildings Cord had never been invited into, in the hours when the rest of the town was asleep. There had been 3 other deaths in the past 18 months. A prospector named Robert Crane, who had filed a claim on the North Ridge, right on the boundary of land Harwick had been trying to acquire for a year. A land surveyor from Abilene named Daniel Marsh, who had spent a week in the valley measuring distances that certain deeds depended on, distances that Harwick did not want measured by anybody he had not paid to measure them. A young woman named Caroline Webb, who had been the bookkeeper for the mining consortium for 2 years, quiet and precise and very good with numbers, until one morning she was not the bookkeeper anymore, and a week later she was found at the bottom of the South Ravine with a broken neck and a story that she had been walking in the dark and missed her footing. All 3 had been ruled accidents. All 3 inquests had been presided over by Justice of the Peace Harold Gear, who ate supper at Harwick's table every Sunday without fail, and whose house had been paid off by a loan from Harwick's bank 3 years ago at an interest rate of nothing. Cord had looked at all three. He had stood over all three the way he was standing over Thomas Eddy now. He had known what he was looking at each time. And each time he had gone back to his office and written down what he knew in his careful hand, and put the notes in a drawer, and told himself that what he had was not enough. That he needed more. That he needed something a judge in a real courthouse could not dismiss. That a man like Harwick had lawyers and connections and a reach that went further than Redstone Creek. And that one sheriff with a notepad full of suspicions was not the same thing as a case. He had told himself all of that. He had believed it because he had needed to believe it. He had told himself those things for 18 months. And now Thomas Eddy was face down in 4 inches of water with a bruise on the back of his head. And a 12-year-old boy had watched the whole thing happen before supper. And Cord Pickett's boots were getting wet. And the reasonable things he had been telling himself were not saying anything anymore. He carried Thomas Eddy out of the river by himself. He laid him on the bank and covered him with his own coat. He stood there a moment with his hand resting on the coat above the dead man's shoulder, and he said something under his breath that was not quite a prayer but was not nothing either. Then he walked up the hill to his office. He sat down behind his desk and put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them. They were the hands of a man 44 years old, scarred across the left knuckle from a fence wire when he was young, steady enough but not as quick as they had been once. He had arrested men with these hands. He had pulled a drowning child out of this same river 10 years ago with these hands. He had filled out more reports and more forms and more death certificates than he could count, and he had done it all with the steady quiet competence of a man who believed that doing the work correctly was the same as doing it bravely. He had been wrong about that. There was a mirror on the wall across from him. He had hung it himself years ago, because his first sheriff, an old man named Greer who had taught him everything worth knowing about the job, had told him that a lawman ought to look at his own face every morning before he went out and looked at anybody else's. Make sure you recognize yourself, Greer had said. Make sure the man in that mirror is still the man you agreed to be. Cord had believed that when he hung it. He had believed it, and then, gradually, without meaning to, he had stopped looking at it very carefully. He looked at it now. The man in the mirror had gray at his temples and a scar along his jaw from a fight in another town a long time ago that he no longer liked to think about. He had the badge on. He had worn that badge for 11 years without taking it off to sleep. He had a drawer full of notes that nobody had ever read. He opened the drawer. He took out the notes. He spread all 18 months of them across the desk in the lamplight, and he read through every page, the way you have to read something when you are finally willing to believe what it says. Names, dates, distances, witness accounts from people who had come forward quietly and then, just as quietly, stopped coming forward. A pattern so clear and complete that a man would have to be working very hard not to see it. He had been working very hard. He read it all. He sat with it. He did not reach for any of the reasonable things. He let himself know what he had been knowing for a long time without saying so. Then he put the notes in his coat pocket and stood up and took his rifle down from the wall rack and checked the loads in both the rifle and the pistol. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the doorframe and he looked back at the mirror one more time. "Do it right," he said to the man in the mirror. "Whatever else you are and whatever you have been, do this right. Take him alive. Let the law do what the law is supposed to do. And don't you close that drawer again." He walked out into the street. Ruby Bell's diner was the last light on Main Street at that hour, the way it always was. Ruby kept the lamps burning until 9 o'clock on the principle that a hungry man deserved a hot plate no matter what time the sun went down, and that a town with a light still burning in a window was a town that had not entirely given up. Cord pushed through the door, and Ruby looked up from wiping the counter with her gray hair pinned back, and her apron still tied, and her expression the same it always was, steady and careful, and about 5 degrees warmer than she let on to anybody who didn't know her well. "You look like a man who's made a decision," she said. "I've made a decision." She poured him coffee without asking. He sat down and told her about Thomas Eddy, all of it, starting from the drawer and going forward. Ruby Bell listened the way she always listened, which was completely, without interrupting, without her face changing more than it needed to. When he was done, she set her own cup down and folded her hands on the counter. "How long have you been sitting on what you know, Cord?" "A year and a half." She nodded once slow. "Why tonight?" He thought about the answer honestly before he gave it. "Because a 12-year-old boy should not have to carry what Jesse Calhoun is carrying home to his mother tonight. And I should have made sure of that a long time ago." Ruby looked at him steadily. "That's the right answer," she said. "It's a year and a half late, but it is the right answer. I know it." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to arrest Clayton Harwick. He's going to stand in a proper court in front of a proper judge, and I am going to put in front of that judge everything I have got." Ruby was quiet a moment. "His men won't let you just walk him out." "No, they won't. So I need witnesses. Not just my notes. I need people who will stand up in a court and say what they know, and I cannot do this alone, Ruby." She looked at the dark window. She was quiet a good while. "Francis Dowd," she said at last. "She kept the books for the mining consortium for 2 years before Caroline Webb died. She knows where the money went. I believe she has been knowing it for a long time. Cord. Yeah. Lena Marsh too. She worked the mill office. She saw the land claim filings. She saw how he was moving them. And old Pete Garfield on the North Ridge. Pete watched them push Robert Crane's markers with his own eyes. He told me himself 2 years ago and then went quiet. Did Harwick threaten him? He burned Pete's fence line. Twice. But Pete is still here. Why is he still here, Ruby?" She looked at Cord straight. "Because he has been waiting for somebody to go first," she said. "They have all been waiting for somebody to go first." Cord nodded. "That somebody is me." "Yes, it is. You understand what that means. I might not walk back out of this." "I understand it." "Then you had better go talk to Pete Garfield first." "And Cord." "Yeah. You do this right. Don't go in hot. Don't let Harwick push you into something that a judge can't sort out cleanly. You bring him out alive and you let the court do its job. That is the plan. Is it a good plan, or are you just saying so?" He almost smiled. "It's the best one I've got." She refilled his coffee. "Then go talk to Pete," she said. "And tell Jesse Calhoun's mother her boy did everything right." "I will," he said. "I will." Pete Garfield lived in a 2-room cabin at the end of the North Road, set back against the tree line with a vegetable garden along the south wall and a dog that had its own complicated system of warnings. The dog barked twice at strangers and once at people it knew. It barked once when Cord came up the path, which Cord took as a good sign. Pete opened the door before Cord knocked. He was a tall thin man of 60-something with a white beard and hands like old wood, knuckled and scarred from 40 years of working land that did not give anything up without argument. He looked at Cord's face and at the rifle in his hand and at the set of his jaw, and he stepped back without a word and held the door open. They sat at Pete's table and they talked for 2 hours by the light of an oil lamp. Pete told Cord everything he had been carrying for 2 years. He told him things that filled in gaps in the notes, names and amounts and dates that fit against what Francis Dowd would later produce like a key going into a lock. He told him the name of a freight agent in San Saba who had been moving silver off the recorded books for 3 years and splitting the difference with Harwick in cash. He told him what he had seen from the ridge on the night Robert Crane died, the lanterns moving in the dark below, the men, the long silence after, the walk back down alone in the morning to find the markers moved and the claim post pulled up. He had never told a living soul. His voice was level the whole time. Not flat, not cold, just the voice of a man who has carried a weight so long he knows exactly how much it weighs and has learned to walk straight under it. When Pete finished, Cord asked the question plainly. "Will you say all of that in front of a judge in a proper courtroom?" Pete looked at the lamp. He picked at the edge of the table with his thumbnail. Outside, the night was very still. His dog had come inside and lay under the table with its chin on Pete's boot. Pete said, My fence line will not survive another burning. I know that. I am 62 years old and I have got 3 good years on this land maybe, and nothing left to leave anybody when I go. He paused. I have been thinking lately about what a man wants to have done before he is done. Not the land. Not the fence line. Something different. Something that was worth the trouble of being alive for. He looked up at Cord. Yes, he said. I will say it in front of any judge you put in front of me. Every word. Thank you, Pete. He shook his head. Don't thank me. I should have said it 2 years ago. We both should have done things 2 years ago, Cord said. We are doing them now. Pete stood up and took his hat off the peg behind the door. I am riding with you, he said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. He put his hat on. That is exactly why I am doing it. Frances Dowd was awake when they knocked. She was a small woman of 40 with precise eyes and ink stains permanent on her right hand from years of double-entry bookkeeping. Her husband worked the freight line 3 weeks out of 4, and her 2 daughters were already asleep down the hall. She opened the door and looked at Cord and then at Pete and then at the rifle, and she said, Is tonight the night? Cord said, Yes. She said, Give me 5 minutes. She went inside. They heard her moving quietly in the back. She came out with 3 ledgers under her arm, thick books worn at the corners and filled from cover to cover in her small careful hand. She held them out to Cord. These will say more than I can say out loud, she said. Every number he moved. Every name he used to move it. Every account the money landed in and left again. I have been keeping these since Caroline Webb died. I did not know who to give them to. Cord held them carefully. He said, You have been carrying these for a year. She said, I have been waiting for somebody worth giving them to. Are you coming? She looked back into the dark house. Her daughters were asleep. Her husband was 3 days out on the freight run. She turned back to face him, and her jaw was set firm, and her eyes were dry. Yes. Lena Marsh came without being asked. She was already on her porch when they came up the road, as if she had been watching for them, as if some part of her had known, the way certain people always seem to know when a thing that has been gathering for a long time is finally about to break. She was a young woman of 20-something with red hair and a jaw that had the look of something carved, and she had worked the mill office filing land claims for 2 years and had kept a very careful memory of everything she had filed. She stepped off the porch and fell in with them without a word, and she matched her pace to theirs, and she did not look back. Ruby Bell had locked up the diner and taken off her apron and come out onto the street by the time they came back down Main Street. She did not ask. She simply walked with them. 5 people. Cord with the rifle. Pete with his hat pulled down and his dog trotting alongside. Frances with the ledgers under her arm. Lena with her steady eyes and her signed account folded in her coat pocket. Ruby with her arms at her sides and her chin up. 5 ordinary people walking down the center of a dark street in a town they had all lived in for years, a town they knew board by board and lamp by lamp and face by face, towards something that frightened every one of them and that every one of them had decided was more important than the fear. Later, when people talked about that night, and they talked about it for a long time, they talked about what it looked like from the windows. How those 5 people looked walking down the street together in the dark. Not like a posse. Not like a mob. Just like 5 people who had made a decision and were going to see it through. People said there was something in the way they walked that made it look inevitable. Like watching a river find the place where it means to go. Harwick's men were at the mill. 3 of them on the steps. Armed and expecting something, which meant Harwick had heard something was coming even before Cord had decided it was coming, which told its own story about the kind of man Harwick was and the kind of operation he ran. Cord walked up to them and he did not stop and he did not slow down. The first man put his hand toward his belt. Cord said quietly, "Do not do that." He said it the way a man speaks when he has already thought through every outcome and is prepared for all of them and is not afraid of any of them anymore. The man's hand stopped where it was. The second man looked past Cord at the 4 people behind him and something shifted in his face. He looked at Frances Dowd and her 3 ledgers and he stepped to the side. 1 slow step to the left. The third man looked at the second man and then looked at the ground and sat down on the porch steps and put his hands on his knees and kept them there. Cord went inside. Clayton Harwick was at his desk in the back office. He was a big man with the kind of weight that comes from years of eating well and never having to do any of the hard physical work himself. And he wore a good coat even at this hour and his hair was combed because he was the kind of man who was always prepared to be seen. He looked up when Cord came through the door and his expression did not change the way a good poker player's expression does not change. He looked at Cord and then past him at the others filing in, at Pete Garfield's white beard and Frances Dowd's ledgers and Lena Marsh standing with her arms at her sides and Ruby Bell in the doorway behind them all, and something moved in his eyes for just a moment, something small and quick like a fish turning in dark water, and then the smooth look came back over it. Cord. Harwick. Thomas Eddy is dead. Harwick's hands did not move on the desk. I am sorry to hear that. He was a capable worker. Cord set the rifle across his arm. I am placing you under arrest, Clayton. For the murder of Thomas Eddy. For the murders of Robert Crane and Daniel Marsh and Caroline Webb. For fraudulent filing of land claims. For theft of mineral rights in 3 counties. For conspiracy. Harwick smiled the smile of a man who has been smiled past trouble for 38 years. Cord, I don't know what you think you have here. I have these, said Frances Dowd. Her voice was level and clear, and carried no more emotion in it than a ruler measuring a distance. She walked forward and she set all 3 ledgers on Harwick's desk in front of him. Every transaction for 3 years. Every account. Every name. Every dollar. Harwick looked at the ledgers. His smile did not move, but his color did. Frances, he said carefully. You should think very carefully about what you are doing. I have been thinking carefully for a year, she said. I am done thinking. I am ready to talk. Harwick looked past her at Pete Garfield. Pete Garfield looked back at him without expression. He looked at Lena Marsh and Lena Marsh looked back with her jaw set and her eyes steady. He looked at Ruby Bell in the doorway, and Ruby Bell looked at him the way she had looked at men she did not respect for 40 years, which was directly and without apology. He looked at Cord last. His smile went away entirely. You are making a serious mistake, Mr. Pickett. The mistake has already been made, Cord said. It was made 18 months ago and I am here to correct it. Stand up, Clayton. He stood up. They walked him out through the front of the mill, past his men on the steps, the one sitting with his hands on his knees who did not look up as they passed, out onto Main Street where a light had come on in a window, and then another, until by the time they reached the sheriff's office the whole street had lights in it, and there were people in the doorways watching. Not cheering. Not shouting. Just watching. The way people watch when something they had given up believing in happens in front of them, and they need to see it twice before they let themselves understand it. Jesse Calhoun was on the corner with his mother. Clara Calhoun had her arm around her boy and her chin up. As Cord walked past with his prisoner, Jesse looked at him. Cord gave him the smallest nod he knew how to give. Jesse straightened up a full half-inch and gave it back, solemn as a judge. 12 years old in the lamplight with the weight of what he had done in his eyes and something underneath that weight that looked very much like peace. Cord locked Clayton Harwick in the cell. He sat down at his desk. He sent a telegraph that night to the circuit judge in San Saba, a man named Aldrich who had ridden this territory for 30 years and whom Cord had known long enough to trust completely. He sent a second telegraph to the Federal Land Office in Austin. He kept Frances Dowd's ledgers on his desk under his hand. He did not sleep. Pete Garfield sat in the chair across the desk and drank coffee and kept him company in the way of a man who understands that sometimes the most useful thing you can do for another person is simply be present without requiring anything of them. Ruby Bell came back at midnight with food and ate with them and then went home. Frances Dowd sat at the side table and spent 3 hours going through the ledgers with a fresh lamp, writing out a clean summary in her precise hand. Every number, every name, every connection. When she was done, it ran to 14 pages, and it was the clearest accounting Cord had ever seen of how a wrong had been done, and how it could be proven. Lena Marsh wrote her own account beside her. 4 pages of land claim filings with dates and official numbers, signed and dated at the bottom in a hand that did not waver. By the time the sun cleared the ridge the next morning, there was a stack of papers on Cord Pickett's desk that told a complete story from beginning to end. It had taken 18 months to get here. 4 people had died in those 18 months who might not have died. Cord sat with that knowledge, and did not try to put it somewhere it would hurt less. He let it sit where it was. Judge Aldrich arrived 3 days later on the afternoon stage. He was a small dry man with a white beard trimmed close and eyes that had the look of eyes that had been looking at the truth of things for a long time and had stopped being surprised by any of it. He read everything Cord gave him without stopping. He sat in the office for 4 hours and he asked questions that went straight to the center of things and he listened to every answer. Then he set the papers down and he looked at Cord. "Why did it take you this long, Pickett?" "Fear," Cord said. "I was afraid." Aldrich said, "Of what exactly?" Cord thought about it honestly before he answered. "Of being wrong. Of starting something I could not finish. Of making it worse and leaving those people more exposed than before." Aldrich was quiet a long moment. "Those are real fears," he said. "I will not tell you they are not. But they are not sufficient. A man in your position has to decide what is more dangerous, the risk of moving or the cost of waiting. And you waited too long." "Yes, sir. I know it." "Good. You know it, and you did not wait forever." He picked up the papers. "For what it is worth," he said, "this is the most complete case I have received in 30 years on this circuit. The women who assembled these documents did something remarkable." "Frances Dowd did," Cord said. "Her and Lena Marsh. They held on to what they knew when they had every reason to stop holding it. The credit belongs to them and to Pete Garfield and to Jesse Calhoun." Aldrich looked at him a long moment. "No," he said. "The credit belongs to all of you equally, including the boy. Do not let him forget that." The trial was set for October. It was held in San Saba in the county courthouse, a stone building where the ceiling was high and the light came through 4 tall windows along the east wall in the mornings and fell across the gallery in long clean stripes. People came from 3 counties to sit in that gallery. Not because a trial was entertainment, but because for the people of Redstone Creek and the country around it, what happened in that courtroom was the answer to a question they had been living inside for years. Whether the law was real. Whether it applied to a man with a mill and a name that had been in the county since before the county existed. Whether the things done in the dark in Redstone Creek could be said out loud in daylight and mean something. It was a long trial. Clayton Harwick's lawyer was a skilled man from Dallas who knew how to speak to juries and how to plant doubt in the places where doubt could grow. He worked hard. He challenged every document. He questioned every entry in every ledger. He pushed Pete Garfield on the distance and the light from the ridge that night. He tried to establish that Lena Marsh had a personal grievance. He was thorough and he was capable, and he lost completely. He lost because Frances Dowd sat in the witness chair for 6 hours and answered every question with the same quiet precision she had put into those ledgers for a year, and there was not one number he could shake and not one name she could not account for. He lost because Pete Garfield told what he had seen from the ridge in a voice so plain and so unhurried that 3 members of the jury were openly weeping before he finished, and the other 9 sat completely still. He lost because Lena Marsh knew the filing system of the mill office better than anyone alive and could walk any person through it step by step until they saw exactly what she had seen, and when the lawyer suggested she had misunderstood she looked at him and said, "I did not misunderstand, sir, and I have not forgotten, and I kept a copy of everything, and I still have it." And he lost because Jesse Calhoun, 12 years old in his best shirt with his hair combed, sat in that chair and told what he had seen at the river in a voice that did not shake once. He described the light. He described the men. He described Thomas Eddy being carried. He described walking up the hill and standing in the doorway. He told it plain and straight from beginning to end. And when the lawyer tried to suggest that the light had been poor and the distance had been considerable, and a boy of 12 might have misremembered, Jesse looked at him with dark steady eyes and said, "I saw what I saw, sir. I told the truth of it to the sheriff, and I am telling the truth of it now, and I would tell it again in front of God Almighty himself without changing one single word." The gallery was completely silent after Jesse said that. The lawyer sat down. Clayton Harwick was convicted of 3 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy, and 14 counts of land fraud. He was sentenced to hang. 2 of his men received life sentences at Huntsville. Harold Gear was removed from office and charged separately. The freight agent in San Saba received 12 years. 11 other men in 3 counties faced charges. Over the following 6 months, every stolen land claim was returned. Every mineral right taken was restored. Families who had lost stakes got them back. None of that undid the 4 deaths. Cord knew that. He had always known that, and it did not stop being true because the trial went well. That was the weight he was going to carry as long as he lived. Not as punishment. Not as something he could pray away, or drink away, or reason himself out of. As a reminder. The same kind of reminder that a scar is. Something that says, here is what happens when you wait too long. Do not forget it. Because forgetting is how it happens again. On the day of the hanging, Cord stayed in Redstone Creek. He had stood at enough hangings. He walked the town instead, end to end, the way he had walked it every morning for 11 years. He said good morning to the people he passed. He stopped at Ruby Bell's for coffee. He checked on Pete Garfield, who had gone back to his land and was mending the fence line with a post driver and a level, working steadily in the October morning light. Pete saw him coming up the road and set down the driver and took off his hat. "How are you holding up?" Cord said. Pete said, "I slept the whole night through for the first time in 2 years." "That is something," Cord said. "That is something," Pete agreed. He stopped at Frances Dowd's house. She came to the door with her ink-stained hands and her eyes quick and alert as always. "How are you, Cord?" "I'm all right, Frances." She looked at him the way she looked at everything, straight and precise. "You sleep better last night?" "Some." She nodded. "It comes back," she said. "Sleep comes back when the thing keeping it away is settled." "Thank you, Frances." She shook her head. "Don't thank me. I did it for the same reason you did. Because it had to be done and because I was tired of being the person who knew it had to be done and was not doing it." He went to Jesse Calhoun's house last. Clara came to the door, a small careful woman with dark eyes who had been raising Jesse alone for 5 years and who had done it without asking anything from anyone. She looked at him and said, "Sheriff." He said, "Ma'am. I came to say what I should have said that first night. I wanted to say it to you first. Your boy did the right thing from beginning to end. He saw something terrible and he told the truth of it. He told it to me, and then he told it in that courtroom in front of a gallery full of people and a lawyer who tried everything he knew to make him doubt himself, and Jesse did not doubt himself once. He held what he knew and he told it straight. A lot of grown men I have known in my years as a lawman could not have done what your son did." Clara's eyes filled. She stood with her hand on the door frame. "He is inside," she said quietly. "He has been a little quiet since the trial. The way a boy gets when he has carried something heavier than he should have had to carry." "Can I talk to him?" Cord said. "Yes. Please come in." Jesse was at the table doing arithmetic on a slate board. He looked up when Cord came in, and his face was careful. Cord sat down across from him, and did not make it a formal thing. He said, "How are your sums going?" Jesse said, "Slow." Cord said, "Mine always went slow too." They sat a moment. Jesse said, "Do you think it would have been different if I had told you sooner?" Cord considered it honestly. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe. What I know for certain is that you told the truth when it counted, and that truth put the right man in front of the right judge, and that matters even when you cannot see all the ways it matters." Jesse was quiet. Then he said, "I keep seeing the river. Cord said, I know. That does not stop right away. But it gets further back over time. You put enough good days between yourself and it moves. Does it go away? No, Cord said. Not entirely. But it stops being the first thing you see in the morning. You have got a long time ahead of you, Jesse. A lot of mornings. A lot of good things to put between you and that river. The boy looked at the slate. He said, My mother said you were going to stay on as sheriff. Cord said, For a while yet. Jesse nodded seriously, with the gravity of a boy who has seen enough of the world to understand that these things matter. That is good, he said. That is the right thing. Cord walked home in the late afternoon light. The cottonwoods along the road had gone yellow, that deep clean October yellow that only lasts about a week before it all comes down, and the air had the cold edge that comes to the high country when the season turns. He could see the ridge above the town where the silver was still in the rock, where it had always been, belonging now to the people it had always rightfully belonged to. He could see Pete Garfield's new fence lying straight and solid against the hillside. He could see the lights of the town coming on one by one in the dusk. He thought, the way a man thinks things at the end of a long day when his guard is down, about what a town actually is. A town is not the buildings. It is not the streets or the deeds or the accounts in the bank. A town is the agreement its people make with each other about what they owe one another, about what they are willing to say out loud and what they are willing to do when the saying costs them something real. Redstone Creek had broken that agreement, and 4 people had died inside the breaking of it, and then 5 ordinary people had picked the agreement back up and carried it down the center of the street at night and laid it back in place. That was what towns were made of. Not timber and stone. Not money and deeds. The people who walked the streets and decided, in the small hours of their own private reckonings, what they could live with and what they could not, and then acted on that decision in the daylight where it counted. Cord had been a lawman for 11 years, and he had learned in those years that you cannot force that decision in another person. You cannot command it, or frighten it, or reason it into them from the outside. It has to come from inside, from that quiet place every person carries where they keep the knowledge of who they actually are underneath all the fear and the careful practical reasons for waiting. Ruby Bell had always known it was in her. Frances Dowd had known it was in her for a year, sitting on those ledgers, waiting for the right moment or the right person or the right whatever it is that tips a person from waiting into doing. Pete Garfield had been standing on his ridge watching his fence line burn and waiting. Lena Marsh had been filing her copies and waiting. Jesse Calhoun had walked up the hill and said what he saw and waited to see what would happen. They had all been waiting for somebody to go first. Going first is the loneliest thing a human being can do. Not because you are alone when you do it. You are almost never alone when you actually do it, because the going first is the thing that tells everyone else that it is possible, and they come. But the moment before it, the moment when you are standing in front of your own mirror in your own office with the lamp burning and your hands on the desk and the notes spread out in front of you, that moment is entirely yours. Nobody can live inside that moment with you. Nobody can make the decision for you. You stand there and you look at the man in the mirror and you decide what he is made of and whether you are willing to find out. Cord had stood in front of that mirror too late, and he would carry that the rest of his life. He was not going to put it down. A man who puts that weight down stops feeling it, and a man who stops feeling it stops being careful, and a man who stops being careful does it again. The weight was the price. He intended to pay it every day. But he had picked it up. That was what mattered now. Late and imperfect and a year and a half behind where he should have been, he had picked it up and carried it and done what had to be done. And Frances Dowd's daughters were going to grow up in a town where the law applied to every man equally. And Pete Garfield's fence line was standing. And Jesse Calhoun was at home with his slate board, building the good days that would put the river further and further back. And Thomas Eddy's mother in Houston had received a letter explaining what had happened to her son and what had been done about it. The letter would not be enough. He knew it. But it was the truth told completely, and that was the most honest thing he had been able to give her. He pushed through the door of Ruby Bell's diner. Ruby looked up from the counter. "You look better," she said. Some, he said. She poured him coffee, and he sat down, and they were quiet for a while in the warm light with a lamp burning steady in the window, and the town settling in for the night outside. The kind of quiet that has comfort in it. The kind between people who have done something hard together and come out the other side and do not need to say so. Ruby said, Frances Dowd is talking about running for the town council. Cord said, she would be very good. She would run that council the way she kept those books. Ruby said, Lena Marsh has written to a judge in Austin about reading law. She wants to become a lawyer. Cord thought about that a moment. God help any man who has to argue against Lena Marsh in a courtroom, he said. Ruby laughed, a short warm sound. Cord smiled into his coffee cup. Outside, the stars were coming out one at a time over Redstone Creek, and the light in the window was steady, and the town was quiet, and the ridge above it was solid against the dark sky with the silver still in it where it belonged. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. There is a moral to this story, and it is simple, and it is old, and it is true. Courage is not the absence of fear. Every single person who walked down that dark street in Redstone Creek was afraid. Pete Garfield had been afraid for 2 years watching his fence line burn. Frances Dowd had slept with those ledgers in the house, afraid of being found with them, and equally afraid of what it meant if they were never used. Cord Pickett had been afraid of being wrong, afraid of the power Harwick held, afraid of starting something he could not finish, afraid of making the lives of the people he was supposed to protect worse than they already were. Lena Marsh was afraid every day she walked into that mill office after Caroline Webb died. Jesse Calhoun was afraid standing in the doorway of the sheriff's office, and he was afraid in that witness chair when the lawyer came at him, and he told the truth anyway. Every one of them. All the way through. Courage is not the absence of that. Courage is the moment when you look clearly at what you are afraid of doing, and you look clearly at what you will become if you do not do it, and you decide that who you are matters more than what you fear. That is the whole of it. That is what these stories are trying to say. Not that some people are born braver than others. Not that heroism belongs to the young or the strong or the people who carry guns. But that it is a decision, available to any ordinary person at any ordinary moment, in any town where a lamp is burning in a window and there is still time to stand up and say what is true. Every one of us has a drawer. Sooner or later life puts something in that drawer that asks to be taken out and said out loud at a cost. The question each of us has to answer alone, in front of our own mirror, in our own small hours, is whether we will open it. Cord Pickett opened his too late. He knew it and he lived with it. But he opened it. And in opening it, he gave 5 other people the permission they had been waiting for, and together they did what none of them could have done alone. And the truth was spoken, and the law worked the way the law is supposed to work when the people inside it decide that is worth something. Wherever you are watching from tonight, that truth is yours to do with as you will. In the years that followed that October night, Redstone Creek changed the way a place changes when the thing that had been pressing down on it is lifted. Not all at once. Not without difficulty. But steadily, the way a field comes back after a hard season, slow, and then all at once in the spring. Frances Dowd ran for the town council the following year and won by the largest margin any candidate in the history of Redstone Creek had ever received. She served for 12 years, and in that time she rewrote the land claim filing procedures for the entire county so that what Harwick had done could never be done the same way again. People who came to her with complaints about how their claims were handled found that she listened to every word and that she remembered every detail and that she did not stop until the thing was resolved correctly. She was not easy to disagree with, and she did not try to be. She was just. Lena Marsh did read law. She spent 4 years studying under a judge in Austin, working days and reading nights, and she passed the bar examination on her first attempt. She returned to Redstone Creek and she opened a practice in a small office off Main Street with a sign on the door that said her name and her profession in plain letters. In her first year she took 11 cases for people who could not afford to pay her, and she won 9 of them. She charged the ones who could afford it a fair rate and not $1 more, and she kept accounts as precise as anything Frances Dowd had ever kept. She practiced law in Redstone Creek for 31 years. She was very good at it. Pete Garfield finished mending his fence line that October, and then he built it out another quarter-mile to take in the pasture his neighbor had signed over in gratitude for what Pete had done. He ran cattle on that land for 11 more years, until the year he turned 73, and his knees finally said enough is enough. He sold the land at fair market value to a young family that had come up from San Antonio with 3 boys and the look of people who intended to stay. He moved into town and took a room at Ruby Bell's boarding house, which Ruby had opened in the room above the diner after her husband passed. He ate breakfast at her counter every morning until the morning he did not come down, which was a Tuesday in March of the year he turned 79, and when Ruby went up to check on him, she found him in the chair by the window with his hands in his lap, and his face peaceful, and the first light of the day coming in across his white beard. Jesse Calhoun grew up to be a schoolteacher. He taught arithmetic and history and reading at the one-room schoolhouse in Redstone Creek for 22 years, and he was the kind of teacher that children remembered their whole lives, not because he was easy or because he told them what they wanted to hear, but because he told them the truth and expected the truth back and never pretended that hard things were simple. He had a way of looking at a child who was afraid to say what they knew that his students recognized, later in their lives, as the look of a man who had been afraid to say what he knew once himself, and had learned something from it that he was passing on. He married a woman named Addie from the next county over when he was 26. They had 4 children. He told them the story of the night he found Thomas Eddy in the river when each of them was old enough to hear it, not to frighten them, but because he believed, as Cord had told him, that it was better to know what the world contained and to know also that ordinary people could face it than to be unprepared for either. Ruby Bell ran the diner for 40 more years. She outlasted 2 more sheriffs after Cord, and she knew the name of every person who ever sat at her counter, and she remembered what they took in their coffee, and she never once turned away a person who was hungry and could not pay. When she finally closed the diner, at the age of 81, because her hands had gotten too stiff to do the work she had always held herself to, the entire town came out for the last service. People drove in from 3 counties. The line stretched halfway down Main Street. Ruby stood behind the counter one last time, and she served every person herself, and she did not let anybody help her. When the last plate was cleared, and the last cup was washed, and the lamp was turned down, she stood at the door for a long moment, and looked at the empty diner, and then she locked it, and went upstairs and went to sleep. And in the morning she was just a woman who used to run a diner, and was not finished living yet. Cord Pickett wore the badge for 14 more years after the trial. He served out the rest of his term, and then was elected twice more without opposition, which in Redstone Creek was not something that happened to sheriffs as a matter of course but was something that had to be earned every day in the ordinary work of the job. He opened every drawer that needed opening. He did not always get it right and he did not always get it done in time, but he did not wait when waiting was the same thing as refusing, and he did not look away from what he did not want to see, and when he did not know what was right he asked the people who knew better than he did and he listened to what they said. He retired at the age of 58. He kept the badge. He had a small house at the north end of town with a garden in the back that he tended with more care than he had ever given anything in his life except the job, and a dog named after his old Sheriff Greer who had died 15 years before, and a habit of walking to Ruby Bell's every morning for coffee that he never once broke in 23 years of retirement. The mirror stayed on the wall in the sheriff's office after he left. The next sheriff left it there and the one after that left it there too, because by then it was understood in Redstone Creek, the way certain things become understood in a town that has been through something together, that the mirror was not decorative. It was there because a man who had looked into it honestly on a hard night had decided to do the right thing, and the town had lived differently because of that decision, and the mirror was the reminder. When visitors asked about it, the sheriff on duty would tell them the story of Cord Pickett and the night he opened the drawer. The story got a little bigger with each telling the way stories do, a little cleaner, a little more like something that was meant to happen rather than something that a scared and flawed man had stumbled into doing right at the last possible moment. Cord himself, if you asked him, would tell you the real version, the one with the 18 months in it and the 4 deaths and the drawer that had stayed closed too long. He thought the real version was more useful. He thought a story about a perfect man who was never afraid was not a story anybody could use. But a story about an ordinary man who was afraid and did it anyway, that was a story that belonged to everybody. That is the version he told until he died. That is the version worth telling.